right, and without much further ado, we're going to get started. We have 60 minutes today, and it does sort of put a time crunch in what we're trying to do today to provide you this day one of our series. So just very quickly, we are Project Muse, and it's improving outcomes for multilingual students with exceptional needs. And I'll let you know a little bit more about our project today. What we are going to be doing today is we're going to be taking a 60-minute deep dive, as much as that is possible, on the tiers of instruction and intervention. We are specifically going to focus in on two resources, the MTSS infographics and our Jamboard. This is part of a series designed to build our practitioner toolkit. These are designed to be take-and-go resources for practitioners serving dually identified students. Today's resources are accessible using the bit.ly link that you see on your screen, as well as by scanning that QR code. If you check in the chat, you'll see that I am also dropping in the link to today's slide deck. Know that the slide deck is inclusive of all of the resources that I'm going to be referencing today. So feel free to access the resources in any one of those three ways, either by clicking on the link in the chat, scanning this QR code, or entering this bit.ly link. So meet the team, meet the Muse team. Our team is composed of 4 individuals. It's Christina Zavala, who's our senior director, Dr. Deborah Montoya, who is our lead executive consultant, and Lupita Olguin Rubio, and myself, Vanessa Lopez. We are a small team, but fully committed to improving outcomes for multilingual students with exceptional needs. We are part of the Special Education Resource Leads, which is a project funded and managed by the California Department of Education and CCEE. We are incredibly lucky and just thrilled to be participating in partnership with the CDE, which facilitates CCEE's work with the Special Education Resource Leads, which are meant to work collaboratively within the California statewide system of support to improve outcomes for students with exceptional needs. We are part of the Special Education System of Support initiatives. You will see that there are legislative SPED projects, Building Capacity Leads team, Special Education Content Leads, direct funded programs, as well as Content Leads, EWIG grants, and additional state agencies. We are incredibly lucky to be able to partner with all of these initiatives to truly improve outcomes for students who have disabilities or students who meet eligibility criteria under a variety of programs and supports in the California statewide system of support. The way we engage in this work is by being capacity builders, connectors, facilitators, so that we can help meet the needs of all learners, including students with disabilities. And in that spirit of collaboration, I thank you all for being here today as we engage in this work. You'll notice that today it's just me. I'm all by my lonesome today. So I will be manning both the chat and also taking care of our presentation today. So if you need some support, or if you have some feedback for me, go ahead and drop it into the chat. I'll be referring to it often. You'll see me glance off to the side as I do that, because I am manning the chat and monitoring it as well for your feedback. So to set the context for today, first, I want to go back to that initial introduction of our team. My name is Vanessa Lopez, and I am here today to present to you day one of our Building Your Own Toolkit, Take-and-Go resources for practitioners serving dually identified students. Today, we're going to be focusing in on all things related to tiers of instruction and intervention by using an infographic and a Jamboard. The structure of these sessions are just focused in on a high leverage resource that will support your practices. So our session outcomes for today are going to be related to reflection and refining. We're going to be reflecting and refining on our site-based Tier 1 instruction, as well as Tier 2 and Tier 3 interventions, by engaging in this reflection tool to enhance current practices. So you'll see at the bottom of my screen right here, these two high leverage resources. The first is the Tiers of Instruction and Intervention Jamboard, and the companion piece to engaging with that resources are the Tiers of Instruction and Intervention Infographics. So I really want to highlight one of our approaches in the work that we do, and that is a team lift approach. When I introduced our team, you'll notice that we had Cristina Zavala, Dr. Montoya, Lupita Holguin Rubio, and myself. The makeup of our team is incredibly intentional. Lupita's background is all things general education, specifically English language learners, having been a general education teacher, a coordinator at our curriculum and instruction department here at the County Office of Education for many, many years. Christina and Debbie both are bilingual assessors, school psychologists by trade. Debbie and Christina both have been special education directors, SELPA directors, and what I bring to the table is special education teacher, practitioner, case manager background. So I taught for 18 years at a K-6 elementary school setting locally here in Imperial County, in both an RSP, quote unquote, and SDC setting. So again, that pull in, pull out, push in, as well as self-contained model for providing special education services to our students. Additionally, I'm a an adapted physical education specialist and an assistive technology assessor. Additionally, the one that is probably the biggest feather in my cap is that I am mother to a young man who's on the autism spectrum, who is an English learner, who has a secondary disability category for other health impaired for ADHD combination type, as well as generalized anxiety disorder. So all of these perspectives come into play when we plan our supports and these learning opportunities with our peers and practitioners statewide so that we truly can engage in this team lift approach, because it is in fact a heavy, heavy lift. Because with that in mind, we must recognize that this has to be a collective commitment. If we truly want to ensure the academic success, linguistic progress, social emotional well-being of our dually identified students, it is in fact a shared responsibility for and provide opportunities for us to work together with parents, families, school and district professionals so we can truly promote educational equity, quality teaching, and learning experiences. You'll also note that some of the resources or some of the links that we provide here are linked directly to the California Practitioner's Guide for Educating English Learners with Disabilities. And we do this because the guidance provided in this guide, though not binding on local educational agencies or other entities, except for those statutes, regulations, and court decisions that are referenced within, it is meant to be an exemplary document full of best practices, resources related to dually identified students, but knowing, of course, that its compliance with all of these practices is not mandatory, with the exception of those statutes and regulations and court decisions that I mentioned earlier. So let's start by setting the context. Context is incredibly important as we have this conversation because we must know our why. So in setting the context for what we are doing here today, specifically on those two resources related to the multi-tiered system of support, that Jamboard and those specific tiers, the reason that we want to highlight on that one resource is because we know full and well that there has been an uptick, a consistent uptick in students receiving special education services. So you can see this table here and see that there's been a growth. And yes, it makes sense that as population in the state builds, those numbers are going to increase as well. However, I propose to you that we begin looking at these data points as a means of setting a context for the conversation that we're having today with an overarching statewide need, which is the need to discover and discuss what a root cause analysis could be for that over-identification of English learners as students who also require special education services. So I'm going to go ahead and start making that context visible to you all so that we can engage in this conversation related to the resources we're going to be sharing. So statewide, students with disabilities in California, around 75% are not classified as English learners, with 25% being English learners, in fact. So again, picture this, all students with disabilities in California, a quarter of those students with disabilities are English learners. So I'm giving you these bits of information from a 30,000-foot view. So please keep in mind that it is important to know where it is that we are as a state, but what's more important to the work that you do day in and day out is being familiar with your current data. So as you're wondering, what might your local data look like, start thinking about who you might want to reach out to be able to access some of this information to engage in deeper conversations. So that 25% piece, it lets us know that about 1/4 of our students with disabilities are English learners. However, I want to invite us to peel a layer off and start thinking of our English learners as not monolithic. And some of you know this full and well as you engage with students who are English learners day in and day out from multiple backgrounds, cultural and linguistic. However, when we're talking about English learner as that term, we know that there are multiple typologies. So the two that I want to focus us in on today is long-term English learner and at risk of being a long-term English learner. So and a student who is an English learner that is considered a long-term English learner is a student who has been enrolled in 6 or more years and is not making progress. And typically we'll see this group reflected in grades 6 through 12. Those that are considered to be at risk of becoming long-term English learners are English learner students who have been enrolled more than 4 or 5 years without making progress. And typically we'll see this in grades 3 to 12. And that makes sense because when we're looking at the definition of 6 or more years, typically would place students in that middle school, high school grade span. However, those at risk, if you go by those 4 or 5 year guidelines in the definition, we are looking at grade levels 3rd through 12th. So the tools that we're going to be engaging with today really have an important role in supporting some of the data that we're going to be looking at here, which can be a little concerning. So I invite you to look at this very first graph here. And this is all English learners, okay? All English learners without disabilities, okay? When we're looking at English learners without disabilities, we have, again, the focus is on LTEL and at risk and those who are LTELs. 10% of our students are at risk of becoming long-term English learners. When we're looking at students who are already long-term English learners, that number jumps up to 18%. So 3 to 4 years, not making adequate progress, 6 years or more, not making progress also. When we look at the second graph over here, what we see is a little shocking. When we are looking at students who are at risk of becoming long-term English learners, that jumps up 3 percentage points to 13%. So 13% of our English learners with disabilities are at risk of becoming long-term English learners. However, when we look at this gray section of the pie graph, we see that 40% of our English learners with disabilities are in fact long-term English learners. What does that mean for our practice? Well, let's look at that guiding question up at the top. How might the impact of over-identification be illustrated in these graphs? I want you to go ahead and take a minute and drop your comment in the chat on how might the impact of over-identification be illustrated in these graphs. I invite you to connect with us and share in the chat, and know that we are provided here with a brave space where we are open to learning, where we are open to reflection, when there is no judgment, rather team growth, team lift, that collective commitment involvement. So go ahead and drop in the chat, how might the impact of over-identification be illustrated in these graphs? I'll give you a minute. What might this mean for over-identification, specifically when we're looking at long-term English learners and those at risk? Thank you. So there are a lot of long-term English learners with the disability group, which might indicate English language issues versus potential disability. There might be a struggle with language, but not a disability. Older students with disabilities who may have language disorders or learning needs may not be reclassified as English proficient at their own level. Half of the numbers are reclassified, yet double are long tail. So are we unclear of language difference versus disability? Absolutely great feedback, everybody. So a couple of things that were mentioned in the chat are absolutely things to consider as teams. If you are here as an individual, then this is like a great slide to share with your teams back at your site. If you're here as a team, it also prompts some discussion and some peeling back of additional layers as we start engaging in this conversation related to over-identification and our students, because it absolutely has an impact on how it is that we approach the tiers of instruction to support those determinations made to distinguish if we're looking at a language difference or a disability. So I want to highlight the following slide because it is important for us to know what the home languages of our multilingual learners with exceptional needs are statewide. And I do this for two reasons. Number one, so that we can be clear at what it is that's reflected, but also what is not. I know that there are many districts with multiple languages and dialects spoken, and I know that a point of wondering is often, why are so many of our bilingual assessment tools, especially if we're making determinations, are available only in English or in Spanish? And you'll see the percentages here give you a why. So we have a high percentage of students who are whose home language is Spanish. So of course, publishers are going to engage in more work related to those languages that are more represented statewide. So it's, again, setting the context, like those additional slides, that initial slide that I shared with you, we are setting the context for the conversation that we're going to be having around MTSS and how we begin to refine our practices related to that. So now to go a little bit deeper now, we're funneling into more granular data now. So we talked about 25% of our students who are English, who have a disability being English learners. We also talked about that relationship between over-identification and also how it is that we end up with so many long-term English learner students with disabilities and how we have a diminished number of students who are able to reclassify. And that is also directly linked to the following data point. So when we're looking at the top 3 occurring disability categories, these are specific learning disability, speech or language impairment, and autism, again, statewide. These are students who are English learners by qualifying category. So roughly 75% of our students with disabilities who are English learners qualify for special education services under these 3 disability categories. Go ahead and drop in the chat what thoughts come to mind as you are looking at these statistics. What about these statistics give you pause? SLD, 44%. Speech or language impairment, around 21%. Autism, 14%. How might these be related to, again, over-identification? And do these percentages reflect students with disabilities who are also English learners in your school? Again, that wondering, right? Language difference or disability. We're wondering about additional data. What might this look in contrast to students who are not English learners? Is it comparable? Many districts being ID'd as SIGDIS for SLD. So yeah, absolutely, all of the above, all of the above. So there is a language component to these three disability categories. Again, we're not saying that this is in fact true. We're just saying that the way that these disability categories are approached and sometimes assessed end up not being too clear if we're looking at language difference versus disability. So additionally also is thinking about those assessment tools and also thinking about those interventions and that tier 1 instruction, because again, important for us to be clear as teams who are assessing and making determination for our students who are English learners that we are in fact finding indicators of a disability and not just those related to a language difference. Because of the 13 distinct disability categories, or 14 if you want to count established medical disability, none of those are English learner. So we want to ensure that we are clear when making these determinations. And this is particularly important when we're talking about our pre-referral process for special education eligibility. So you're wondering, okay, well, I thought today was all about MTSS and how we refine our practice. It's important for us to, yes, of course, focus in on the resource, but also on in the context where it fits. So here I want us to ignore part 1, but go to number 2 and number 3. When we're looking at identification of students' targeted needs via the team process and pre-referral activities and interventions to include progress monitoring and data collection. Why? Because here is where we are beginning to make determinations that are going to be supporting either an appropriate referral for special education assessment and potential qualification for services or not. When we're looking at significant disproportionality, when we're thinking about wanting to reclassify students who are English learners with disabilities, a lot of those steps can be trellised back to this specific section so that when we are making determinations whether they are meeting eligibility criteria under one of the 13 distinct disability categories for SPED support, or whether we have ample information to make these determinations, it is all rooted in that pre-referral process, specifically on the quality of that tier 1 core instruction and tier 2 interventions and supports. So before we move forward, again, true or false, I want to get a feel for the temperature of the team here. Can students with IEPs receive supports in the tier 1, tier 2, and or tier 3 intervention groups? True or false? Drop a T or an F. Absolutely. Absolutely, everyone. Yes, an overwhelming waterfall of T's in the chat. So what we do know is that all students with an IEP have access to the general education intervention as any other student. And this is in addition to their individualized special education services. Their IEPs take this into account as part of that comprehensive plan. So I'd be remiss if I didn't mention the following, and that is the fact that tier 3 is not special education. Myth busting is incredibly important in these sessions because it really helps us, again, set that context so that the work that we're doing, that heavy lift that we're doing as a team, really has a smooth transition towards moving that needle forward. So let's take a look here at what these tiers are. So when we're talking about the multi-tiered system of support, we're talking about instruction and intervention. So let's jump into the definition of these levels. So when we have some considerations prior to referral for special education eligibility, what we're looking at today is this intervention summary process, where the overarching guiding principle for all students is universal design for learning. These principles are used beginning in the planning stage of instruction and throughout all tiers. And the reason I say this is because the MTSS framework for instruction and intervention for dually identified students, as we engaged in that true or false, is inclusive of all tiers. So our students who are English learners, prior to being referred to special education because of lack of academic progress, should have been receiving Tier 1 core instruction in all content areas, including ELD, comprehensive ELD. Also, we know that our students should have access to interventions if necessary in Tier 2 and Tier 3. So we're looking at these tiers as a way of having a clearly defined and established SST process that is inclusive of the tiers of instruction and intervention. Your MTSS framework in the academic context right now is about operationalizing your pre-referral process. Why? Because this is going to help us collect data, collect all those information points that are necessary for us to make appropriate referrals, for us to begin fashioning and organizing a robust student profile. Now, I have to recognize that although Tier 1 core instruction, Tier 2 interventions, Tier 3 interventions as a component of the MTSS framework, though it's been around for a while, there are still some elements that require teasing out and clarification. And here is where the tools that we're going to be unpacking today come in. I know that this process of setting the context has been a lengthy one, but it is important for us to know where these pieces fit in. So as I mentioned earlier, the focus today are in these two sections related to the pre-referral process prior to establishing a need for special education. So when we're looking at this bottom arrow, pre-referral is the overarching process. The MTSS framework provides a means of us looking at what Tier 1 core best instruction is in all content areas, including comprehensive ELD. If Tier 2 intervention is necessary, as well as if Tier 3 intervention is necessary based on data. And to be able to do that, we need intervention summary. We want to make sure that some of the difficulties that our students are engaging in are in fact related to a potential disability and not language difference, and not cultural factors, and not additional linguistic factors. Doing that can be difficult when this is not necessarily our area of expertise or an area where we have been spending a lot of time in refining our existing skills. So hopefully these tools are going to support you in identifying what these tiers of instruction and support look like at your site. So here's tool 1. This is the very first resource that we're going to look at. Let me give you a little bit of context for this resource. So this is a Jamboard activity, and you may want to do it as included here. We've included as a Jamboard that will be prompting you to make a copy so that you can retain in your Google Drive. But know that this can also be made into a hands-on activity if you'd rather do that. So what we're going to do is you're going to click on the link if you have the slide deck available. If not, I can copy the link address and drop it in the chat. So what you'll do is you are going to click and make a copy as you're prompted. And I want you to consider the following. When you are using this Jamboard back at your sites, if this is a tool that you want to engage with as part of your PLC or your community of practice, this very first step, I highly recommend doing it independently, individually, meaning that each team member would complete their own Jamboard. And it is not meant to be used as a got you don't know what tier 1, tier 2, or tier 3 is, but rather to establish a clear picture of how we are in awareness. I like to use the analogy of gears, right? We are all part of the system, and the system runs on well-oiled, appropriately spinning wheels. Thing is that sometimes we are independent individual gears and we're spinning wildly, right? And what happens is that we're not connecting with the other gears, right? So in having activities like this that are reflective in nature, that are informative in nature, help us depersonalize what can be a, let's say it, a little bit of hard conversation, right? Because everyone is working hard to achieve what they set out to do, which is to improve outcomes for all learners. So it is important for us to have a tool that allows us to engage in these conversations that is fully depersonalized. This Jamboard activity will allow you to see what your team understands to be a tier 1 instructional support program practice, a tier 2 intervention support and or practice, and a tier 3 support practice program, etc. So I'll give you a minute or two. This is not time. I know that it's not enough time for you to fully engage with the activity, but pop it open. Let me show you what it's going to look like. It's going to prompt you to make a copy. And as a team, later on, you're going to come as a team. Right now, the first step is to create your sticky notes. And you are going to write whatever it is you think belongs there. Read 180. And I'm going to save it. And then I'm going to put read 180 where I think it belongs. I think it belongs in tier 2. And you are going to populate your Jamboard individually, independently. Step 2 of this activity would be to then bring teams together and discuss their Jamboard. Where did you put read 180? Where did you put system 44? Where did you put seeing stars? Where did you put corrective reading? And have a discussion. And here is where this part of the process stops. Again, like I mentioned, you can engage with the Jamboard electronically, or you could also use it on chart paper, on a whiteboard, however would support your team best. So here's where we stop with this part of the activity, and we leave it open. We don't close it. Let's go back to our slide deck so we can continue with what's next in the process. Because remember that this session today is about providing you with the resources to take back to your sites to inform your own practice or that of a team that you work with. Hopefully it's a team, because again, that team lift approach is critical to this very nuanced and heavy work that we do. So once we have that, one of the things that you want to provide your teams with is what it is and what it isn't. So once we allowed them to have that free flow and pasting those stickies under tier 1, tier 2, tier 3, we want to go back and ensure that we have a firm understanding of what tier 1, tier 2, and tier 3 supports are. And again, I really want to highlight the fact that this is not a gotcha moment for us or for our team members. It's more of a reflective practice. So we would have access to the definitions of what these tiered interventions and supports are, so that teams can then begin thinking like, oh my goodness, okay, I put correct SRA corrective reading under tier 2, but based on what these infographics say, it's actually more of a tier 3. So again, what you will have access to now is this slide that will provide you with a brief introduction to what tier 1 core instruction is. But because we believe in practicing what we preach, we've coupled it with an infographic, a visual support to guide you as to what tier 1 core instruction is. So as your teams have the Jamboard open and they are learning a little bit more about what tier 1 is, they may want to start looking at that Jamboard and thinking about where they would want to move things. They're not moving anything just yet. Right now, it's just reflection and discussion, because then we want to move in to tier 2 targeted supplemental supports. Tier 2 targeted supplemental supports are above and beyond that tier 1 core instruction in all content areas, including comprehensive ELD. Tier 2 targeted supplemental supports are additional evidence-based support for some students needing more academic, behavioral, or social emotional help. And again, if English learners require tier 2 intervention for ELD, they should be provided access to that level of intervention. Here we're progress monitoring more frequently than in core instruction to make sure that the interventions are working. If the team finds that tier 2 intervention isn't sufficient for students to be making progress, then we want to have intensive individualized supports that are targeted and focus in on a small number of students who need it. All of these data points that define what intensive individualized supports from tier 3 are included in this infographic. And these infographics are available to you electronically, but you may also download and print to use them as an anchor to your discussions related to what exists locally in your LEA, in your school site, in tier 1, tier 2, and tier 3. Now, it may be that after you have that initial Jamboard engagement with your teams or for you individually, and even after utilizing that infographic for tier 1, tier 2, and tier 3, there are still some areas that are not clear. So when those areas are not clear, it is important for us to have a non-example and an example. And usually the non-example is a more helpful tool. So figure 2.8 here, it's linked in your slide deck, is available for you to pop open so that you can see what tier 1 intervention, what tier 1 instruction is, first best instruction, core instruction, and then tier 2 and tier 3 as comparisons as well. So when we're talking about tier 1 instruction, we are saying that it is high quality, grade level, standards-based. It's culturally sustaining, and is also inclusive of integrated and designated ELD, aka comprehensive ELD for English learners. What it is not an environment in which only some students are included, affirmed, and successful, and some are not. Again, that UDL approach to core first best instruction. Typically, and I say typically because we know that there are many variables, around 85% of our student population should be able to make adequate progress academically, social, emotionally, behaviorally with tier 1 core instruction if UDL is part of the beginning planning process and throughout. So what this means is that from up front, we are considering every single one of our learners, the multiple typologies, not just in the English learner group, but in all students, because we know that variability is the norm, not necessarily the exception, is going to be critical so that this number of students, or a large percentage of our students, are successful here. Again, this includes comprehensive ELD. ELD is not an intervention. All English learners must receive in the state of California what is called comprehensive ELD, which is inclusive of integrated throughout the day in tandem with the grade level content standards, and designated, a set apart protected period of time where the focus of instruction are those ELD standards. So because we've been in the education field for very long, and even if we haven't, we know that for some students, that first best core instruction may not be enough. We know that around 15% of our students are going to require additional supports. This is supplemental instruction in addition to the core grade level instruction. And here we're looking at focused and targeted skills that are associated with broader academic success. It is also inclusive of instruction aligned with the California ELD standards. So approximately 15% of the students in any given class, grade level, or school will require these tier 2 supports. It's important for us to know that it is not a replacement of the core curriculum. It is not time to reteach concepts. It is not designed for students who did not master a specific skill or concept. This is part of that differentiated instruction. And for more than 15% of, if we have more than 15% of students that are requiring tier 2 intervention, then this may be a reflection of a need to refine tier 1 instruction. So what I want to call out here is that it is not meant to replace tier 1 instruction. This is an intervention, not instruction. So where it gets really tricky in all conversations with teams is distinguishing between tier 2 and tier 3 supports. This graphic here, figure 2.12, does a great job at helping us look at by section what tier 2 is and tier 3 is. Because typically, like as practitioners, we want to know, well, how many days, how many minutes, how many hours, for how long? We want to have those details, but know that these are approximations, these are guidelines, and it's meant to be as a reflective tool, again, to have that depersonalized conversation as to what we have as our existing tiers of instruction and intervention are and how they compare to what is given here as a guideline. So when we're looking at the organizational factor of tier 2 interventions, we're looking at 30 minutes allotted for instruction, 3 to 5 days a week. Tier 3, however, is more intensified. Here we're looking at 45 to 120 minutes a day, around 5 days a week. And know that tier 2 and tier 3 are above and beyond tier 1. And it is possible to have students in different tiers for different academic areas. When we're looking at the assessments that we would use to determine progress or the need to move up or down in the tiers, tier 2 assessments may be group-based. Sometimes they may be individually based and are meant to be diagnostic in nature, to tell you what specific areas you are going to be working in. So for example, simply having a conversation around, well, I have about 15 kids who struggle with comprehension. I'm just going to give them additional comprehension instruction. Well, it's important for us to know like what elements specifically related to comprehension should be targeted, because then again, you're going to be working super hard to improve their comprehension when the elements necessary might not be related at all with understanding the question, but might be more related to reading fluency and making sense. Or they might be related to vocabulary, or they may be related to a lack of background information related to the topic that's being assessed. So it's important for us to keep that in mind. And these assessments, whether they be group-based or sometimes individual for Tier 1 intervention, or specifically individually applied for students for the diagnostic assessment for those truly targeted instructional minutes that we know, if we look above, are pretty lengthy, 45 to 120 minutes, 5 days a week. And I think here is sometimes why there is a misunderstanding that Tier 3 is special education. And that's because some of these guidelines are so similar, right? So when we're working on a particular goal, students are pulled out to work specifically on that goal, and they're coming in daily, they're coming in for a set amount of minutes a day. So that's where a lot of the misconception is. However, we know that in order for Tier 3 to be called special education, or actually, let me rephrase that. If to differentiate between Tier 3 and special education, what is required is that assessment portion. You are going to need to complete the documentation necessary, an assessment plan to be able to conduct assessments in suspected areas of disability, completing those assessments, completing that psychoeducational assessment battery, and creating that report, sharing that information, and then making that determination that the student, in fact, meets eligibility criteria for special education. And that is the difference. However, it is possible for a student who, perhaps going back to our graphs where we were looking at the top 3 disability categories. Let's say we have a student who qualifies for services under SLD, and specifically in math. That is where they have some gaps in math that go above and beyond Tier 1 instruction, Tier 2 intervention, Tier 3 intervention. The team has determined eligibility, and services are provided to support that. However, if the student is having difficulty in written expression, and there have been assessments that indicate that there is a need for intervention, for support, then of course they would still have access to Tier 2 or Tier 3 interventions in those additional areas that aren't necessarily part of the manifestation of the disability. Okay, so those two are the easy ones, organizational factors and assessment factors. Where it gets a little tricky also for practitioners, those providing the interventions, are in the instructional factors. So when we're talking about instructional factors, we're looking at the opportunities to respond, meaning how many chances the student is having to give a response to engage with the instruction, the instructional focus, the behavioral expectations, the review and repetition that's needed, how students are being provided with error correction, as well as scaffolding. So when we're looking at Tier 2 versus Tier 3 and opportunities to respond, our kiddos who are receiving Tier 2 interventions, 6 to 8 opportunities to respond per minute. Tier 3, 8 to 12 opportunities to respond per minute. So what I want you to think about, I don't know how many of you are familiar with what used to be SRA corrective reading. You would do something where it would be, you would have some letters on the board, on the overhead projector. Oh my goodness, I'm dating myself. On the projector. And you point to the letters that are printed and you say, this sound is what sound? This sound is t. what sound, and students are responding. So that is what we're talking about in opportunities to respond. They might be in written format if the intervention is being provided in writing. They might be related to mathematical facts. Whatever it is that is the core of the intervention, we're wanting to give those opportunities to respond. And then the scaffolding elements, error correction elements also are pointed out here, how they differ between tier 2 and tier 3. So as teams are coming back to their Jamboard, or as you as an individual, if you're doing this for your own learning right now, are going back to your Jamboard, start thinking as to what you identified as being a tier 2 and a tier 3, and wondering if they need to swap or if they even fit there to begin with. So you at this point are ready to revisit the Jamboard activity. May you need to rearrange the tiers of support at your site. Or if you're doing this independently, may you need to rearrange the tiers of support at your site or what you have available at your classroom. Or this is a wondering that's come up before in working with site-based teams. They'll say, well, you know what, to be quite honest with you, I don't even know what's fully available. I am the speech and language pathologist, and I'm having all of these kiddos that are coming in with speech as a service because of their eligibility criteria SLI, but I'm finding that in the IEP, I'm having to write more and more academically based accommodations that aren't related to the manifestation of the disability. So I don't even know like what's available. And that is so important to surface if that is the case, because what's important for us is to not be stuck there. Well, I don't know. Let's think of that team lift. Who might you want to reach out to? Who might know what's available? Is there a resource teacher at your school site? Is there a curriculum coordinator at your school site? Is the principal that person? Is it somebody else who's wearing multiple hats? Who might have a list of what is available for tier 1, tier 2, and tier 3? If no such lists exists, who might be tasked with that? Who might want to consider developing that resource? Because again, this is not something that can be done by just one person. If we truly are using diagnostic assessments, whether they be group-based or individually based, we want to know who's going to be doing those interventions. Are they going to be housed just with the general education teacher? Are they going to be a grade level approach where there's an exchange? So all of these determinations really rest upon having open reflection, open dialogue, using a resource that is depersonalizing a conversation that can be a little challenging sometimes. So when you are working with your teams or when you are working independently with this Jamboard, you may want to go back and move some of those stickies around. Why? Because as part of your discussion, let me pop this open. There are some guiding prompts here that will help the teams reflect upon what they are and what they aren't. So the instructions here tell you how to duplicate your initial frame. So you would go back to this frame, you would click on the 3 dots there and duplicate if you want to keep a pre and a post, right? So that you can see where it belongs. So if I go back to my tiers 1, 2, and 3, my initial one, my pre, another one that I want to add in there will be SRA corrective reading, save, and I may have put it here under tier 2. Now, looking at what it is and what it isn't, tier 2 and tier 3, I know that Tier 3 provides all of these opportunities to respond. So I know that based on that, and because it is specifically focused on phonemic awareness and phonics, and that there is individual assessment components, and I am doing this, what's that word? And a lot of that prompting and more that we do approach. Now I know that it is not a tier 2. I know that it is a tier 3. However, because I want to keep my pre and my post, what I'm going to do is I'm going to pop this open, going to duplicate, and here it is. I'm on tier 2 now, and I'm going to label this one post so that I can see how I'm going to move things around. So I'm going to move SRA corrective reading here, and then have a conversation with my team as to why I moved it, right? So when we are back on our slide deck, I want to share with you the last couple of bits of info because I know we're pushing that 1:30 end time. What I want to have you do is think of ways that you can make this activity more accessible for your teams. And one of the ways that I've suggested to teams in the past is to have this become a group-based activity using chart paper and providing teams with these infographics so that they can refer back to and use as a resource and a reference as they're building their own understanding. Because really, the end result of the Jamboard for tiers of instruction is to highlight the fact that instruction and intervention summary data as part of your pre-referral process should be based on clearly defined and consistently implemented tier 1, 2, and 3 instruction and interventions. It should not be just something like, you know what, I see them struggling and I'm just going to refer them for SPED. Well, what data do we have? What data do we have to make sure that we are making appropriate recommendations for assessment, right? So with that in mind, the 60 minutes together that we spent today, we're really focused in on tier 1, tier 2, and tier 3, building our understanding of what they are and what they aren't, being reflective as to what exists in our sites, what our understanding of tier 1, tier 2, and tier 3 supports and instruction are at our sites, and if we need to really recalibrate where it is that they belong. To support you and your teams, I've also included a note-taking guide that helps guide discussion so that you can have some documentation as to the reflective conversations that are taking place to truly refine your practice. Or in the case of individuals that are like, you know what, we do all of this and it's super clear, we have a listing, it really does become a way of validating the hard work that we're doing. And knowing that even if we had some misunderstandings, even if we had to move some things around, the learning is there and actionable next steps are available. With that, I know it was a lot of information and I really do want to thank you. I know this time frame overlaps with lunchtime for some of you. So that means even more for you to be here joining us as we build our collective expertise to support students who are dually identified. And I want to leave you with our contact info. If you want to get a hold of us here at Project Muse Multilingual Students with Exceptional Needs, feel free to do so by either visiting our website and filling out a contact us form or utilizing this email that will come to all of us here at Imperial County SELPA. You may also wish to write us if you want to do that. Here's our address or contact us by phone. Know that today's session will be recorded if that outage didn't throw a wrench into it, and that will be forwarded out to you via the email that you utilized when you enrolled in OMS for this session, and that we have a couple of dates coming up. And what I am going to do is I am going to stay on as long as you need me to answer questions. I know that I have a couple that came up in the chat. So if you need to go, know that I appreciate you and that you are absolutely welcome to contact us at any time to clarify any questions or to set up some office hours. So I'll stay on as much as we need to. And feel free to unmute or send a request to unmute. I don't know what I have my settings set up as. So I'll stay on as long as you need me to. So as we are closing up, I really want to address a question here that's for students who access Tier 3 support and have not yet been evaluated for SPED, who would provide this intervention. So Tier 1, Tier 2, and Tier 3 interventions and instruction are a general education function, just like the SST process is a general education function. All of these the Tier 1 instruction, of course, is the general education teacher that's providing that Tier 1 core best instruction. Tier 2 and Tier 3 could be provided by that same general education teacher if they're participating in an exchange, or even if they're doing it throughout class time, that could be done by the one teacher. I've seen some school sites where they do it by grade level, and they might do some level of exchange for Tier 2 and Tier 3 interventions. So that is typically a general education function. Tier 3, why are Tier 3 students not automatically assessed for a disability due to the Child Find law? So Child Find requires us to assess all suspected areas of a disability. So unless it is evident that a disability exists, or a team is making a recommendation, you know what, it is absolutely clear that this child has a disability, then we want to ensure that we are being responsive to that specific need. However, if we are looking at if a child is receiving Tier 3 supports and, let's say, writing, right? I would want to know more before making that that recommendation for assessment. I would want to know, what does comprehensive ELD look like for this child if they're an English learner? And if I can't articulate that, if I can't find documentation that indicates that this child was receiving consistent comprehensive ELD, both designated and integrated, then I am going to really want to make sure that I am not making a recommendation based on a language difference issue, meaning a student who is learning English as a second language, and just not being clear if that is an indicator of a disability. So if the case is that the team decides as part of the SST process or as part of their MTSS process to make that recommendation, I would still want to collect data related to the ELD instruction. Did the student receive consistent Tier 1 core instruction and comprehensive ELD? Did they receive additional interventions and supports in ELD? So that we can tease out if it's a language difference or a disability. And if we have all of that, assessment teams have an obligation to assess in the child's primary language. Now, we know that for some of our students that speak other languages where bilingual assessment tools aren't available, or there aren't any, or the assessor isn't bilingual themselves in the student's home language, then there are additional practices. There's the first best option, which of course is inclusive of an English assessment, and then the child's primary language being used as an assessment that's provided in their home language. But there are second, third, and fourth best options for students for whom bilingual assessors are not available or bilingual assessment tools aren't available. So it's multifaceted, it's incredibly layered, incredibly nuanced, yet specific through IDEA. So yeah, I know that that was a lot of info.